Hello, we are going to get started here pretty soon. If you guys want to grab a drink and last little nibble and then head to the seating area, that would be amazing.
Test, 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 test. Yes, it's on. Okay.
Hello.
I'm good.
If you're
Hello.
late, you're in the front row.
This is like the most pliable crowd we've had in a while. It's like grab food and sit down, and everybody sits down, so that's nice. So thank you. Welcome to the Cameo Grove. I'm Molly. I am the creator of opportunities here at the Cameo Grove. I get no more joy than introducing Lee Huntsman. And this is our second event with Lee here at the Cameo Grove, and many of you are probably joining us because you've joined Lee at the University of Washington campus, so thank you for making the trek here. We really appreciate it and love to see new faces here. If you haven't been to the Cameo Grove before, we've been open about a year and a half. We have events like this. We have one on Thursday, actually, so please come back if you're not busy on Thursday watching the Sounders win, hopefully. Without further ado, I'm not going to do Lee's whole bio. I'll let
Please
him.
don't.
Yeah, I'll let him introduce himself and Dr. Robert Hershberg. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. As you probably know, the goal of this series is to interview some interesting people with perspective about what the heck is going on with healthcare and what are the implications of it for the rest of us in the ecosystem. Those of us that would fancy ourselves to be innovators or policymakers or business types. The premise, as you know, is there's a lot going on, and we had better be paying attention because things take a long time in healthcare, whether it's an innovation or anything else, and whatever assumptions we make today could very easily be wrong by the time our product gets to market. So that's what we're about with this Under the Boughs. We're trying to take a little longer look and ask people about what are the forces shaping the future of healthcare and what are the significance of the changes. And so it's a great pleasure to have Rob Hershberg with us here tonight. Before we unleash Rob, and you'll come to discover why that's the right verb, let me remind you all that this series is co-sponsored by not only the Cameo Grove, but by the BioEngage program at the University of Washington, which is an offering by the Department of Bioengineering, which is very interested in engaging more actively with people in the non-academic sectors, companies, agencies, nonprofits, etc. And they are very prepared to help you navigate, if you want any help, navigating that monstrous, complicated, capable, interesting place called the University of Washington. So BioEngage is intending to be an access point for you if you so desire. And we're delighted to have their co-sponsorship of this series. One heads up, we're going to collect written notes of questions you might want to ask Rob. So as you go along, jot down some questions. We'll gather those at the end and do a little Q&A with him. So, Rob Hershberg, a clinician, a biotech CEO, now executive vice president and the chief science officer for Celgene, a little company, as you may know. Rob, before we get started, are there any caveats, any conditionality on what we say here? Because a lot of us are going to make investment decisions based on what you tell us.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, thank you very much. I joke, but it's not really a joke that, if Lee asked me to show up in the middle of the night someplace at a Starbucks down in Soto, I would do it. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And I was hoping to hear more about your bio. Maybe we can do that as part of the question and answer.
We won't have enough time for that.
So there is the only caveat is that you remember Harlan Robbins at Adaptive, who made a comment one day that I should be like a NASCAR driver with the patches to represent my different allegiances. So I'm not speaking for Celgene at all. I'm speaking on my own behalf, and please don't interpret anything that I say as, number one, being insightful, which you'll find that it's probably not, but also that it is in any way reflective of the views of Celgene. So other than that, I think we're good.
So, you have, well, I wouldn't call it a checkered background, but
No, you can't. Yeah.
How did you get into this?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I think you
right.
meant a checkered blazer.
How did you get here from? This is a long and torturous thing,
Yeah,
or
so
did you just fall into it, or what?
It's not been linear. I wouldn't say it's been overly checkered, but it certainly hasn't been linear. So, as a kid, I knew I wanted to do science, and was really fortunate to be able to do an MD PhD program. And so I was always in this kind of somewhat schizophrenic mode from the very beginning, which was, do I do science or do medicine? And so I did both. And so the only checkered component probably was my training at your esteemed institution, where I started actually training in neurosurgery with the former chairman, Dr. Wynn. And I joke that, when you see someone sit in the first row, as an intern, we used to have to walk into the back of rounds at Harborview, and you'd sneak into the back, and Dr. Wynn would be up front and say, "Rob, there's a seat right in the front row." So I just, up until probably about a year ago, I still used to always sit in the front row so as not to be shamed by Dr. Wynn. But I did training for a little bit in neurosurgery, and then thought better of it, and did training in general surgery for a while, and realized that I probably wasn't going to be the person that was going to take your gallbladder out. And so I did a fellowship in medical genetics and at the University of Washington with George Stamatianopoulos and Arno Matulski, and then was very fortunate to get a grant that took me back to Boston to the Brigham, and I had an academic lab, and for purely personal reasons returned to Seattle and went into biotech, and ostensibly because Carixa and Steve Reed, who was a founder, offered an opportunity to bring my R01 back and give me a job at Carixa as well. So it's really been kind of it's been a unique opportunity for me to be here in biotech.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the world of biotech and pharma, or what. I guess we can run them all together at the moment. I have to say, from a layman's point of view, it looks like an absolute circus. Pharma and biotech, anything on having to do with drugs is being beat up in the press, right? You've got some bad actors out there. You've got pricing controversies of huge magnitude. You've got mergers and acquisitions going every different way. You've got global markets. You've got Americans that are fed up with paying extra for their drugs so the rest of the world can have them more cheaply. You've got all these controversies, and meanwhile, science and medicine march on. So you're being buffeted from all sides. Is that the way it feels from the inside, or is that just?
It's a fairly dour perspective, Dr. Huntsman. But
right.
I think that, so let me just say that you could take the exact opposite perspective and say there's never been a more exciting time to be in biomedical science. But let's come back to that, because I know that you're more of an optimist than I am about these things. But it is mildly chaotic. And I think if you look at the pharma industry writ large compared to society, I think it's really this reflection of just this profound change. And I've been extraordinarily educated over the past 3 years since going to a large company. This is my first time. I've always been in small cap biotech and been more associated with the venture community than I have been in pharma, that there is a chaotic element. And I don't think it's chaos in the sense that it's random motion, but I think it's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. So, to sort of take a couple of the points that you raised, pricing has become a real issue. And it's a political hot potato. And so in this political season, those of us that don't vote by one issue sort of see how important this is in determining, a political view. And this idea of the EpiPen coming out in the middle of this election and realizing, I don't know if people read that, John Ryan has terrible peanut allergy. That was a mistake. To price that, when the Speaker of the House is your customer. But you see that this is really a problem. That if the perception is so different between the consumer saying, don't raise the price of our EpiPen, and pharma saying it costs $2 billion to develop a new drug, there's got to be some meeting in the middle. And, I've always been a pretty liberal guy, and so I don't want to be an apologist for the whole pharmaceutical industry, but it is enormously complicated. And I think that some of the things that I think we're likely to talk about over the next hour are an attempt to sort of bring that containment down to the point where it's not $2 billion to develop a drug, and a recognition that, in this country, we have access to medicine that other people don't have, and we develop basically the world's new innovation when it comes to biomedicine. So, there's a cost that we have to pay, and I don't think we've quite figured that out.
Well, you mentioned your background, and you've done biotech and almost, like you say, in many ways, closer to venture side of things.
Yeah.
Now you're engaged in a big company with a very notable strategy of investing in new opportunities, and you're suggesting that for all the forces and legitimate reasons for a dour perspective, there's a lot of opportunity too, if I hear you right. But contrast for us a little bit. When I think of a small company, I think of the opportunity to just flat out develop new molecules, right? To do new technology. But when I think of a big company, I go back to this macro picture and say, there's a lot wrong besides the inadequate number of new molecules. The business model is in question. The clinical trials are extraordinarily expensive and complicated, and there are a lot of people questioning whether we have to have some fundamental redefinition of how drugs are developed. Do you have any perspective on that, being now part of a big company?
I do. How much time do we have? So I came at it from one side of the spectrum, which was I worked at a company called Corixa, which ended up getting bought. I don't know if people even remember Corixa in town here, but it was an extraordinary company that was run by Steve Gillis, who started Immunex. And when I got there, we had 60 science programs. It was the best science I'd ever participated in, and I realized that a group of 300 or 400 people can do science that can't be matched in a larger company. But the business model was somewhat flawed in that we were doing science experiments and not really making products. And so I was recruited by Mitch Gold, who some folks may know, who was the CEO of Dendreon. Mitch was a urology resident under me when I was a surgery resident. And so Mitch was just taking over the helm at Dendreon. And so I went to be the chief medical officer at Dendreon for a while, which I often refer to as my time in the gulag, but that's a slightly different story. But I think that, that was this incredible appreciation that all of a sudden, it's the product that really matters in raising money. And I thought that was a successful enterprise, even though it was a bit far ahead of its time. And what you see when you're working in a public company like that you go out to raise money and you have this book of slides. And so it was Marty Simonetti and I, usually against Mitch, we would compete for how much money we could raise and the percent of banks that we would get to commit to the fundraising. And you realize that the moment you stop talking about the last program, the late stage program, which was Provenge, everyone closed their notebook. No one wanted to talk about innovation or anything early. It was all, what's the news flow on your last program? And, what's the status and, timelines, et cetera. So, in my mind, I'm churning that this isn't super fun, right? Because the stuff that we're interested in as scientists and physicians and the innovation is of no relevance to people that are, funding these programs and dealing with stocks. So I took the perspective of going to Fraser and starting a company. I thought, well, I'd been at a couple that I didn't really see had worked very well. And so I was going to, fail on my own and not have to explain to anyone that it wasn't my fault. And so we started this little company that never got bigger than 20 people, raised about $50 million over a 10-year period. And I saw with 20 people that we dosed 650 patients with our drug. And we did things that a big company could never do. And we did a partnership with Celgene, which brought me to Celgene. And now I've been sort of taken into the fold and seen what it's like in a bigger company. And, it's like when I tell my kids, it's not better or worse, it's just different. It is extraordinarily different. So if you now sort of split that question into two, is there something about the way we develop drugs that needs to change? And the answer is yes. But organizationally, I've become a believer that it is not only 100% people, which is totally cliche, but it's that people in large groups do terrible things. They treat each other poorly, they connive, and they get nervous and they're afraid. And you get into these organizations where people are protecting turf, and they're protecting themselves, and they're protecting programs for fear of not being employed, and it has nothing to do with pharma. It has to do with human behavior. And so if you look at these gigantic companies, which are distributed across the world, and if you look at the things, Andrew works with me now at Celgene, and you look at the amount of stuff that I'm responsible for, I can't micromanage the way I did when I was a CEO of a small company. And so I think it's a cultural shift that has to occur in bigger companies to look like smaller companies. And so what you see is this constant reorganization. I didn't appreciate this until I was on the inside, how often pharmaceutical companies reorganize. It's because they get to a certain point where it sort of doesn't work, and then they sort of throw the chips on the ground and sort of pick them up and try to assemble them into a different structure. And I think what you're seeing with Celgene is, in part a recognition that bigger is not better. And then their solution has been to try to externalize a lot of the research and maintain intense relationships with smaller companies on the innovation side. Once a drug gets to a certain point, and that's usually after clear proof of concept is established, I think a big pharmaceutical company is extremely efficient and effective at developing those drugs. Taking it through registration studies, dealing with regulators, and certainly commercial launch. But it's that intersection between where the innovation occurs that I think we're struggling. How's that for a short answer to it?
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, actually. So you're suggesting that sort of a division of labor, according to what the cultures are actually good at. Big companies who can handle some of this in the trenches, get it registered, get it tested type of stuff, and the little companies can innovate in other ways, and so there's a complementarity there.
Absolutely. It's a really complicated food chain, and you think about the number of tasks that are required. It's not a surprise that you're going to see companies that do extremely well at one thing, but not necessarily at another. I think part of the reason Celgene's been so successful, and it's, Celgene's an $80 billion company now that people don't know about, in part, it's because we focused on heme malignancy and on inflammation more recently. It's not a company with, 10 therapeutic areas, because I think there's a recognition that you sort of stick to your knitting and you grow with a core expertise and a vision to grow. So I think Celgene is per person. If you do the ratio of market cap to human, it's amongst the highest in the industry. AstraZeneca has a market cap less than Celgene and 5 times more people.
Really?
Really.
There's that much diversity?
That much.
We tend to think of these big companies as highly similar.
I was astonished. We did a deal with AstraZeneca and MedImmune, and we were sitting across the table from, you're always somewhat, I'm humbled just in general by, I wake up in the morning and just sort of look in the mirror and just think, is this really happening? It's so much fun. And you go to the people at AstraZeneca thinking, these are the big pharma guys that have been doing this forever. And I remember them, I wouldn't say they were super patronizing, but it was a little bit of a, we're the big company and you're Celgene. And I remember pulling out my phone, and I do have the stock app. I'm afraid to say I don't look at it every day. Some days I do, but I looked at that. What's the market cap of AstraZeneca? They must be 2 or 3 times our size, and they've since we did the partnership, they've been 80% of our market cap. Their market cap 60 or 65 billion, maybe 70. So Celgene, little Celgene, is bigger by market cap than AstraZeneca. So I think there is a cultural aspect and a grittiness that you have to maintain to be innovative, and I think that's where we're stumbling a little bit. And I just don't think it's unique at all to pharma.
Well, let's pick this apart one more degree if we could. I appreciate the fact that, okay, different organizations have different strengths, and if we can sort of parse the problems where the strengths are, we could coexist and make some progress. But some of the problems look staggering. I mean, what did they say? Some astonishing 93% of the drugs that go to phase 1 don't go forward, or something like that. That's some astonishing failure rate, and then we have a remarkable failure rate even after in phase 3, right? I mean, and so we got a low yield, we got high R&D costs, we got all these pressures. I mean, who in the ecosystem cares about fixing those things?
So I think this is something that I've been astonished to see from the inside, and I'm very, very fortunate that I have a partner in crime at Celgene by the name of Rupert Vesey. And I don't know if people know Rupert. Rupert was the guy that ran Rosetta after Stephen Friend left and it got bought by Merck. Rupert ran the site and then moved to Merck, and he's been a big pharma guy his whole life. He's about my age, and he's Oxford trained. So I always tease him publicly because he says, I say thorough, he says thorough. And he's this, Oxford guy, just totally buttoned up, but crazy smart. And he and I are sort of teamed up to run R&D. And we have this extremely similar view that the stuff that kind of comes out of early development is often crap. And it's amazing to us, and he's seen this much more than I have from a big organization, is a lack of enforcement of sort of basic things as molecules move into man. What's the scientific hypothesis? What's the patient selection strategy? What are the biomarkers that you're going to use in an initial study to convince yourself? So we call them the 6 R's. And these have all been published because AstraZeneca has gone through this. And this idea of you have no idea how hard it is to enforce this, even in a company the size of Celgene, whose entire research organization is less than 1,000 people. So I think over time, people have been somewhat complacent. And they have because drugs like lenalidomide and others, get approved without these things. And they're reimbursed and they work really well. And so what people see are the outliers. And so now that the payers, and I know this is always a hot topic, and I mean, I'm totally agnostic as to where the pressure comes from. If it's the payers or if it's people's incentive to not ethically treat people with drugs that don't work. I don't care at all as long as we get to this point of starting to select these drugs better in early development. I mean, this attrition that you describe is real, and it's based on a lack of effort, not effort's the wrong word, a lack of attention early in development. And small companies can't really do that because it's existential. And if they do, the drug doesn't fail, the company disappears. Whereas big companies with portfolio, it's almost as if there's sort of an expectation that this is going to happen. And I think my perception is that that's changing. It's changing at the people that are running R&D and are no longer able to accept the number of drugs you move into clinic, but instead are being forced to adhere to a metric that it's the successful drugs that you move into the clinic, as evidenced by advancement into phase 2 or, ideally registerable drugs.
So you could make your mark in a big company of the kind you're hoping for by being rigorous, not just by being the champion for your favorite
Absolutely. In fact,
but
it's
actually being hard-nosed about it.
Right, and it's very interesting. So, when new people come in, there's a lack of historical linkage to certain programs that exist in the pipeline. And so you always feel like sort of a jerk when you're looking at new data, and people are so connected to it. And you're just thinking like, what have I missed? I mean, I'll sit next to Rupert often and it's like, am I missing something? No, you're not missing anything. And then you go up to the person afterwards and you say, geez, this doesn't look great, and then they think, oh my God, this program's dead. And it is. So, Rupert and I came in and sort of cleaned house. And I remember, showing up at Cambridge where a couple of the programs were killed. And there's a group of about 100 people standing around. And I said, I'm sorry that I killed some of your programs. I did it. And the reason I did it was, I didn't think they were going to be successful. And it's not an indictment on you as a person. It's an indictment on the molecule that you were developing, and that I just want to retool your efforts towards things that are more productive. I mean, there's this intense connection that scientists feel towards their work, and I got to tell you that as it's very different than what I would have expected, and maybe it's the yoga, but I go around talking to people about like being kind to one another, like not using your cell phones in meetings, being respectful, the difference between criticism and differences of opinion, and I do think that's a huge part of, I've seen that in a small company that, I remember there's a famous saying by this Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, and it says that when you get to a fire, you don't look for the arsonist, and you put out the fire out. And so I learned very clearly in a small company that there'd be this huge crisis, and I'd say to people, okay, hey, can we put a meeting on the calendar for 2 weeks from now so we can figure out, who fucked this up? And then I'd say, but let's deal with it like now. So that way, by 2 weeks hence, people weren't inflamed and they weren't afraid. We clearly wanted to deal with it, but in big companies, you'd be astonished that people are just sort of hiding in the nooks and crannies. So I think there is a huge cultural part of why drugs are, and this is one man's opinion, so I think part of it is just human nature. Yeah. We cling to things.
Well, I'm grateful for your cultural awareness, because
it's very Seattle, I know.
But your cell phone is out, but you're not looking at it, so I feel very respected.
And if I did, I would say, Lee, I'm going to look at my cell phone now. Would you? Is that okay?
So
You'd probably say no.
When I'm with this crowd, I always think about where's the role for innovation. And when I think of biotech and pharma, you always latch on to the molecules. But I'm wondering about other dimensions of possible innovation in this whole therapeutic sector. So I was stimulated by, the FDA commissioner was in town, 2 weeks ago, something like that. Some of you were probably there. And he said some stuff that got my mind wondering about. So, if you think we're in the era, may not be in the era of personalized medicine, but we're certainly getting into the era of precision medicine, right? We know more and more. We're segmenting patients more and more. And as a consequence, as that goes forward, we don't need 15 new drugs. We need 500 new drugs, for all these subpopulations. And the existing methodology for proving those in clinical trials just won't sustain it. Yeah. The smaller the applicable population, the more burdensome the clinical trial thing comes. And so, I think about precision. Precision gives you diagnostics that you can use to segment populations, and so efficacy trials actually do get smaller, right? Because we can segment. But nobody's figured out how to crack the safety problem. The safety trials have to be gigantic and therefore expensive. But the commish was talking about, I think I heard him right, the more and more movement toward post-market surveillance kinds of stuff. Yeah. Now, is that a theme of what's going on? And then I back up, I look at this crowd, this town, and I say, wait a minute. This is the era of big data. Why don't we have data on every bloody patient in the country and the drugs they're taking? And why don't we just pull safety out of the avalanche of data? What are we missing here?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think you're spot on, actually. And I think that I've been fortunate to work in oncology, where we've led the way. And it wasn't until I became more involved in non-oncology drug development that I realized how much further ahead oncology is. I mean, you think about it, Number one, you've got this therapeutic index in cancer patients, which can be much narrower than in many disease areas, right? So you can tolerate, life-threatening toxicities as long as there's an ostensible clinical benefit. The other thing is, name another disease where people walk into a clinic in New York and get their genome sequenced and their disease sequenced, right? You don't go in and get an arthroscopic biopsy and your orthopod sends, he doesn't even know what DNA is, right? So I sort of joke, but I'll warn you next time. Clearly you go to Memorial Sloan Kettering and, Baselga has made it absolutely, 10,000 patients walk in and get their genome sequenced. So we're pushing ahead with oncology, and I think that's where a lot of the innovation is occurring. So you're looking at the emergence of adaptive designs, and I'll give you an example from the Celgene pipeline, which is a drug we made with Agios, which is one of my favorite partnerships. So it's a drug for AML, so it's AGIOS. It's a drug for AML. It targets a specific mutation, IDH2, in a subset of about 12 to 15% of AML patients. It's a drug that from inception, the molecule is targeted to affect mutant IDH2. Phase 1 was done in patients with mutant IDH2. Phase 1 was a positive proof of concept study, and the drug will be approved on an open label phase 2 study with, I don't know exactly the number, but 100-ish patients. Now, it's a perfect success story from discovery to approval in 5 or so years. And so this is the direction things are going to be going, but it requires that commitment early. And it requires the willingness of an agency now, which is incredibly open to doing that. Now, as you start to get to non-life-threatening illness, then you start talking about registries. But I want to talk about big data a lot because I think it's a huge part about what we're trying to do. But I've been at this long enough to have dealt with FDA a lot, and there's always this criticism from business and banking that the FDA is retarding drug development and they're slowing us down. And I think that's just patently untrue. I think think about the mission of the FDA. It came out of the need for safety and regulation around products that could hurt public health, could negatively affect people's health. Not, you walk into the FDA, they never really probe you about the efficacy component of your data. It's always about the safety. And it's going to take a while before, that moniker is changed towards sort of relative safety. And I think it will be disease specific, but I do think there's an absolute thawing for sure at the agency around that. Smaller trials and more focused development.
We're going to need that to crack.
I think you can't do it. That's why we're talking about this $2 billion. I can tell you, I don't know what the numbers. I probably do, but I'm not going to say. But the numbers of getting AG 221 approved, but it's not $2 billion. I can tell you that.
Right.
And the $2 billion drugs take into account fully burdened costs of 10-year development programs and CROs that have 400 change orders.
Well, one of the little secrets in the $2 billion estimate is half of that is for the cost of the money, which is old data, I think, because the money doesn't.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
It doesn't cost that much anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that right?
They burden the whole thing.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a highly debatable calculation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that means that but even at a billion or $1.5 billion, when it cracked $1 billion, it was this sort of incredibly controversial number. But you can see from the inside, just when you do the math, that this is not far from the truth.
Okay, let me change topics completely.
We're going to talk about data, though.
Okay, let's talk about data.
So I can think of another example that I can't specifically cite for purely confidential reasons, where the ongoing trial is going to use publicly available outcomes data as a comparator. So we're presenting it to the regulators soon. So these approaches that you discuss are occurring in real time. So you're going to see this tremendous push. What you saw 5 or 6 years ago with adaptive designs, which at the time were extremely controversial and innovative, and now are, commonplace. You're now seeing basket trials and, signal finding studies that are different than we used to do. Now, obviously moving towards more targeted and segmented and outcomes-based and registry-based post-approval commitments, and now using external data as comparators. And I think that, I have a high degree of confidence that this is the direction
That's
things are
really
going.
encouraging, because the intuition is that we need innovation all across the board. We need innovation at the regulators, we need innovation at the trial designers.
Absolutely.
Not just in the molecular lab. We need
No, I mean, I think in some ways, the molecular stuff, for those of us that have been doing this for so long, I mean, I remember very well going into the lab during my PhD studies, and there was a separate part of the lab that was dedicated to RNA. I mean, everyone's so young here, but you used to use this thing called Dep-C water, do you remember? So you have to put 2 pairs of gloves on, and now all of a sudden people are doing RNA-seq as clinical samples. I just don't know if there's been an evolution in RNA stability since I went to medical school, but it's amazing now that I don't worry about the technology. You can't sort of look at this device and think that we can't solve every technical problem. It is much more of a statistical and a regulatory problem. That we have the requisite tools now to make molecules better than before, to study them, to interrogate human samples in a way that we couldn't even have imagined.
But that's a good segue to my next question.
Yeah.
Are we in the era of immuno everything?
Of course, we've been there for. I mean, have you read Malcolm Gladwell's Outlier?
Yeah.
So I'm the outlier because, number one, I'm a Jew. I'm son of Jewish immigrants, but I'm also the guy that sort of started working on the immune system during my graduate studies, just because I thought it was interesting and important. And now everything is kind of, I mean, I'm the most fortunate guy in the world in that, I had worked on something long enough and all of a sudden people think it's interesting. And so, I joke that there's not a disease that an immunologist can't explain immunologically. So, I mean, we could do like Stump the Chump, and I guarantee you that there is a strong immune component to every disease. And I think there's this growing recognition that this is true. And oncology has been, in some ways, the hardest nut to crack because the tumor immune system coevolution has been so unique that the tumor has suppressed all of the immune benefit until very recently, when we've been able to at least chip away at some of these ideas. But there's not a disease that is not touched by the immune system. And you start to factor in what the immune system does for a living, which is in part recognize foreign antigens, but in part respond to infectious disease and microbial agents. And then you start to think about the microbiome, the old story that there's 10 bacteria in your body for every cell. I mean, the microbiome is just emerging as a huge part of our ecosystem. And then, this idea that every component of the body is infiltrated with immune cells, and that it's wonderful to see this recognition of the awareness of how the immune system intersects. It's not the only answer, but it's hard for me to imagine a world where immune-based therapies won't touch every disease that we work on. How's that for a declarative statement?
I'm excited. I mean, it's true, and we're all following in your wake because you've been at it for so long. I'm just learning how to spell PAMP and DAMP, but it seems so exciting, and it seems, to me, it triggers a concern of, the great missing thing in healthcare is actually prevention, right? And if you would just back up and say, what about prevention? Well, what's the best preventative strategy? Arguably, it's a really robust immune system.
I thought it was a pound of cure.
Well, maybe. But, we might even get to the point where we understand immune workings a little better and keep them tuned up better, right?
We went, I think the answer is, there's a challenging economic question embedded in
Yes,
that.
there is.
Which is, who's going to pay for preventative medicine, and how do we study? I mean, if you just look at, again, cancer as a proxy, right? We spend a lot of our early development dollars on late stage cancer, stage 4 cancers, untreatable cancers. Most drugs will go into late stage cancer as the first trial and will migrate up. And if you look at Herceptin as a good example, it was approved in metastatic and late-stage cancer, and it wasn't for 5 or 10 years before the adjuvant trials, which were 5,000, 6,000 patients, were showing the benefit in the adjuvant setting, which is still already after someone's been diagnosed. I mean, I look at GRAIL, I'm not sure if people are familiar with GRAIL, which is the Illumina Arch, mega startup where they're doing deep sequencing in plasma as an early detection for cancer. The early data are spectacular. The question is, what do you do with that, right? So congratulations, you're 28, you just got your job at Amazon, and now I've told you that you've got an occult cancer. I can't image it. I've got nothing to treat it, and I'm not sure if this is going to affect your insurability when it's finally diagnosed. So I think we've got a long way to go before those sort of, other than infectious disease, and I do think vaccines are worthwhile, that was kind of a democratic statement, I guess, but I mean, come on, it's election season. We're allowed for 2 more weeks to make some jokes. I mean, it'll be over soon, I'm hoping. But this idea that these preventative, number one, we just aren't that smart scientifically yet. But even from a trial design, payer, I mean, I almost feel like that's almost too big of a problem to grasp.
But I mean, you touched on 2 things. One is diagnoses that are not actionable. Are pretty debatable, right? But you also mentioned the fact that economics enters in here too.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're encouraged to give vent to our natural desires for miracle drugs. We want drugs that cure diseases, right? Because and we got some.
Yeah.
But the economic models of cure, there's 2 opposing points of view. Like, who wants to develop a drug that you give once and that's it? Right? I mean, where's the money in that? But on the other hand, we've got lots and lots of experience with vaccines, which are the model, right? And so, how does this work when you're thinking about either a startup biotech company or a big pharma? I mean,
so again, it's a challenging question, Lee. If you look at some big pharmas, you can look for the big ones that do have vaccine. They still have vaccine groups, and they're still looking at infectious disease as a business unit. I've been involved in venture and still am for better part of 15 years now, and it's really hard for a company to undertake a preventative or early intervention strategy unless there's a suitor in mind. I mean, I don't want to talk about Venti a lot. Venti's a small company that I started, but we did a nasal spray which came out of the data we generated at Corixa. So you think about this, we had a spray which you spray in your nose once or twice, pan-allergen and preventative. We tested it in dogs in a good model that worked. We tested it in humans, had placebo-controlled data that worked, and couldn't sell it to a pharmaceutical company and had to shift everything towards cancer. And it's incredibly frustrating because there's just not a business model for 2 reasons. One is that people can't fathom prevention. There are 30 million people in the country with allergic rhinitis. And the concept of how to deal with that is just too overwhelming. And the second is there's intranasal steroids, which are now generic. So small companies have to face and I didn't know this, I thought, well, the science will take us there, and they did. And, we had to pivot very quickly and survive and turn our attention to cancer. So I think that small companies have to deal with these complex questions, and it's always important to get that feedback from someone, who are you developing this for? I mean, you look at a company like Juno, as a small company, always wanted to be an integrated biotech company and had the capital to do it. But most companies don't start with $200 million, and so it's for that tranche type of funding, which is more typical. I think people have to really think about how forward-thinking you want to be with your business plan. What was the second part of the question?
Well, I'm just struggling with the whole question of really effective drugs. I mean, you got drugs, drugs taking care of Hep C and stuff like
Right.
that, and we don't know how, as a society, we don't know how to do the math.
But look at the controversy over Gilead, right?
Right.
I mean,
right.
I remember very well where I was when I learned that Magic Johnson was diagnosed. I was a medical student at UCLA. Magic Johnson was my idol. And, here he was diagnosed with HIV. And I'd seen all the people at UCLA die of HIV, and I thought, Magic Johnson's going to die. I just couldn't even, John Belushi had just died, and then Magic Johnson was diagnosed with AIDS, and I just thought, this is the worst thing ever. And he's alive and well 25 years later. Now, and Gilead is maligned as gouging on price for a drug that has effectively cured HCV and has very interesting data in HIV. So, we have to be careful a little bit of what we wish for. You look at CAR T therapy, which we're very involved in, and even NICE in England has estimated that curative therapy, the price they put on it is $750,000 a treatment. So what you're seeing is that we were talking about this before, what a payer is. I'm not going to go there because I don't know. But what society will value,
Right.
and this idea that it's per month of extended life. There's a monetary conversion. People will pay for therapies of curative intent. You could make a very strong argument that might not be where society wants to put all its money. But from a business model for companies, there still is, a lot to be gained, both at every level, clinically, scientifically, and financially, from expensive therapies that do good. It's just the paradox that we have to deal with.
Well, you're convincing me that it's just as complicated as we said at the top of
It
this
is.
conversation.
It is. I'm glad I could be so helpful.
So let's, before we turn to questions, if you think about drug innovators, whether they're coming out of a science lab or whatever, or resurrecting an older drug or whatever, what advice do you have for somebody who's going to start a new company or push a new therapeutic these days?
So my first comment would be to do it. I can't describe to you how satisfying what I do is.
Wow.
And I have a daughter that's at the University of Washington, and she's going to the dark side of law school, I think to do policy, although she's not totally sure. But I have a son who is in college and wants to go to medical school and to be a scientist. And he says to me, "How you must be so happy that I'm doing what you've done." And I said, "Well, no, I'm not happy at all that you're doing what I've done. I'm just happy that you found something that you want to do." But inside, I know how wonderful his life is going to be, because I don't think there's ever been a time when we can do more in biomedical science. We've been talking about this for decades. And finally, Andrew and I had the luxury of going out to Google yesterday, talked to the Verily guys, and I'm not saying Celgene's going to do a deal with Google. Okay, Celgene's going to buy Google. Don't say anything. But, okay, this is our secret. But when you see what they're doing and the commitment to change medicine, it is so clear that this is going to happen year after year over the next couple decades. So the only thing I'm just hoping that I get to keep working and see it. The second thing I would say to people is embrace computational medicine. Don't shy away from the new tools, because what we're seeing is the insights that can be gleaned computationally are so different from our perspective, the way we've developed drugs before, that I think one has to embrace, particularly in a situation where you're innovating, all of the tools available to you. And when we set up this site here for Celgene in Seattle, we did third of people in the lab, third of the people doing translational work, which was really to support some existing clinical programs. But we started bringing in these wonderful computational scientists, and from every walk of life. And I can tell you that the insights that this team has brought at a very tangible level are more than I could have imagined. So I would say, be positive, absolutely categorically do it. And the other thing is always that, don't worry about failing, because no matter how efficient we are, and no matter how precise our our tools are, we're still going to fail more than we succeed. This is complicated. And, it's the old story, the old adage of, the best batter still doesn't get a hit 6.5 times out of 10. So, don't be afraid to fail and don't be discouraged by failure as long as you learn and keep moving forward. So I can tell you, I've never been more of an optimist than I've been since this morning. That's true.
That's a great way to wrap up. In the middle of all this chaos, there is opportunity and hope. So
sure.
Great. Questions? Did anybody write down questions? Anybody want to just ask? Oh, don't give it to Don. He knows too much.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. I wonder if I could tie a thread through a couple of things that you've said. You're talking about Gilead and the extraordinary price tags of drugs like that, and it's kind of what the market will bear. And companies like Gilead are fond of citing this $2 billion price tag per drug as the reason that makes sense. But if you thread that together with your earlier comments on kind of the rigor of eliminating early stage programs carefully, don't you think that, my experience in big pharma was that people are incentivized by the company not to weed out things.
Yes, exactly right.
People's career paths are rewarded for not killing things and for, in fact, advancing them even without rigor. The
Yes.
business model of big pharma doesn't reward people for trimming down things to the best. So the failure rate is embedded in kind of the reward structure. And, I guess my question is, do you think there's a way that $2 billion price tag could be greatly reduced if we could figure out a way to get incentives to match rigor?
Yes, in a nutshell. I hope I am not being perceived as an apologist for high prices for drugs, because that's not how I feel. I don't think that's how anybody feels. I think if you were to have the CEO of Celgene here and the CEO of Gilead, I think people recognize that this is not a sustainable model for the industry or society. So I don't think there are many apologists for this. I think there is an element now for some of these drugs. It is a price that people will bear, and it's, we're in a transition from a pharmacoeconomic perspective and from a societal perspective. So I think drugs that have arrived at this point are not going to change. I think people will continue to extract as much value. And again, I was fortunate enough to be with our CEO the past week, and he reminded me of a stat that more than upwards of 80% of Celgene's growth has nothing to do with price increases. It's just increased sales and new drugs that are being developed. So that's the model, not that you jack up the price. And what you see are sort of certain groups that don't have the diversity of a portfolio that are relying on growth based on pricing. It's becoming more of a minority. But to your point of tying that thread together, I think you're 100% right. And I don't think that there's any hiding behind it. I think it's true for every human being, whether they're selling Caterpillar trucks or whether they're developing new drugs for cancer, is that people have their own internal incentives. And they need to feed their families, and they need to stay employed, and they need to do the best that they can. And people are not very close and not as rational when something's right in front of them. It becomes an emotional thing as much as a scientific thing. And I think I can only speak for Celgene, because this is the first big company where I've been, and we are making an absolute committed stance that it's not the number of drugs that advance into the clinic, it's the number of drugs that advance beyond a certain point. And we have these, these goals, and you're exactly right. People get goals. At the end of the year, we have these governance meetings, and December, all of a sudden, like there are 5 drugs that are going to make it to the clinic. You're like, come on, seriously. I mean, it's all bonus time. And so it takes a commitment from the senior leadership to say, enough. We're going to change this to people being rewarded for success in a very different way. And I think that's going to happen industry-wide. And it's not this total altruism. it's just, we can't do it anymore. So I think it's, my sincere hope is that it's going to continue to change. But your points are well taken, and again, I'm not here, as you know, to sort of apologize nor to disagree. Just we have to be better.
Other questions?
Yes.
I just maybe come back to the R side of the R&D equation. You spoke to some of the macro trends happening now, and I experienced that. I worked in the research side, Immunex Amgen for about 20 years, and I've seen a lot of these trends. Interestingly, even though the R side of the equation in terms of total cost is relatively small compared to the D, from the outside investment world, it's what gets the most pressure to make cuts, probably because of all the studies showing the lack of productivity in terms of research and returns over the last 20 years. So as a consequence, you're seeing more pressure to outsource research, either to small biotechs or to academic centers, which I think can work, but it has its own trade-offs, one of which is you're seeing incredible bidding wars now for even preclinical assets. Sometimes they're commanding up to $500 million. And the other comes back to what you touched on, to these, this real need for stringency and best practices that need to guide you from the very beginning, in the 6 R's or however you want to think about it. But oftentimes when you're needing to bid on things from externally, you don't have a lot of control over the amount of rigor that went into those, and yet you're still needing to, you're still in a bidding war with others just because there's so much competition. And I don't know what the answer is, but I've seen it and lived through it, and maybe you just want to talk a little bit about it.
I think it's a really important point. The pendulum swung probably 5 years ago towards this total outsource model. And if you look at it in R or D, I think what people realize that if you go completely outsourced, you're going to fail. You need an infrastructure internally to deal with this model, and whether it's chemistry abroad or in the States, or whether it's CRO management. I think the pendulum on that side of sort of true outsourcing, moving back towards a blended model, and I think it's logical. And as you remember, I'm sure from the days of Immunex and Amgen, it's a dollar and cents argument. How much does it cost versus what's the return? I've been in R&D for a while now, and what I like to tell the R folks is that research is a privilege, not a right. You have to be able to deliver something tangible to the organization to create value. And I think there has been this extreme sensitivity. You can look at the bloated commercial infrastructure, but Gillis, did you work for Steve? So they used to call them Steve used to call them the shrimp eaters. The commercial guys that would go out and feed doctors shrimp to get them to write prescriptions. If you know Steve, you kind of know the tone of his comment. But this idea that there's these people are creating value because they're getting sales, whereas the research people are not. And so I think that's getting a little bit better. And now, Celgene's model, I think, is being adopted a little bit more broadly, which is this blend of external and internal, with the recognition of two things. One is that even though it's external, it requires a ton of internal oversight for reasons that you mentioned. Sometimes these things get crazy competitive, and you sort of look and you're like, what did we just buy? And this is awful. And more, I think, relevant are partnerships now that are being created, at least at Celgene, where those of us, particularly ones that have come from small companies, are trying to say to the partner, okay, we can be the partner of choice, we can provide capital, but more importantly, we can provide things that you don't have. So talks, regulatory insight, a little bit more infrastructure, computational work. And so we're starting to work a little bit more with an inside-out model that blends the best of both worlds. Because I think if you count on small companies, their incentives are almost the polar opposite, right? They're not looking to get things into development, they're looking to get bought. And so that can create sort of strange incentives and quirky behaviors that in the end don't serve the ecosystem very well. So, I'm sort of a person who believes in moderation, and I think that there's an element that it's the inside out where it's going to work really well. And you've seen, for example, Celgene with consortia, you're going to see pharma, I think, participate much more in really targeted consortia. And we have probably the most fun part about the job is the ability to go to either academics, small companies, and say, okay, how can 1 + 1 = 3? And that's really how we approach anything external. I don't think all pharma are doing that yet, but I think smart ones are.
Any other questions? Nicole?
So here at the Camden Grove, we see a lot of big data, health IT, digital health, and other health tech companies. And so my question is, I think ultimately about getting at who's willing to pay for what. And the whole connection of the big data and the drug and the widget or the device that told you the drug was taken, that goes to your phone, that tells the medication adherence group that you avoided, a costly incident because you got the drug in there. That whole package seems like something valuable. How is anybody looking in big pharma at how to deliver the package through build, buy, or partner? And that payers or providers at risk would find that very compelling, and that's a unique and different business model that seems to be kind of nascent right now.
So I think you're describing the future, and again, Google's just one group that we've seen recently, but everything from caps that send to your phone that you've opened it, a contact lens that senses glucose, a watch that pricks you and draws blood and sends it to your doctor, to digitizing electronic medical records further and subdividing and doing outcomes research. I mean, this is the world that we're going to exist in. And I joked, and Andrew was there. I said, 20 years, and Andy Conrad said, no, it's like you're slow. It's I said, so it's not going to be 2 years, maybe it's 8 years or 10 years. So this is where people are going. So I can just tell you Celgene's approach to this. So we describe internally what we call the IKU, the Information Knowledge Utilization. We built a whole new unit and put some of the leadership of the company to try to figure out how to build this. Because you're right, it can't be done internally. It's got to combine some external tools. And one approach would be just go end to end with an Apple or a IBM or a Google and say, here's our problem, you put it together. I think companies like Celgene and most big pharma will want to build certain pieces because the stakeholders are going to be everyone from the commercial people looking for outcomes and the late stage clinical people that are looking for integration of big clinical data, to the early scientists that are trying to figure out what to do with RNA-seq data and stuff that they computationally can't figure out in a systems approach. And so I personally think that this is where companies have to be really smart and targeted. I think it's a hard question for new startups, actually, and partly because I don't understand it the way I understand science and medicine. This is all kind of foreign. I see its relevance, and I sometimes can be baffled and amazed by people that speak in a language that I don't understand, and I think they're really smart. And I have to sort of squint and keep asking questions like how are we going to do that, and when are we going to do that, and how is that going to be valuable? But that, this is the essence of what companies need to do. Because imagine a world where all of this is integrated, where a company can basically own a disease from molecule to outcome. It's all going to be based in data. And I think that I get the sense that people are inching towards it, but like everything else, it's starting to accelerate. And that's why, frankly, I'm so optimistic, because there's going to be utilization of these tools, and that's what's going to drop the price down, unbelievably. You look at sequencing, we all lived in this era where, the first genome sequence cost $1 billion or more, right? Celera and NIH. And now I don't know what the whole genome costs are, but under 500. 500, 300, so now, you can only imagine the impact broadly across the health. I think it's going to save the healthcare system. I really do. And that's why, I think one, you'd have to be a Luddite not to see this coming and embrace it at every turn. And I think there are those of us in some of these bigger organizations that, particularly, again, I'm not coming at it from a computational perspective, but you can't deny its power. And it has to be harnessed and appropriately guided, and it's not going to be computational power for computational sake. But I think this is what's going to turn a $2 billion price tag into a $100 million price tag in the relatively near term. And then once you start getting down to really tractable levels, it's going to guide everything that we do, personally. And I can't wait. I just hope I'm still working. Yeah. I can hear you.
I have a policy and incentives question.
Wait a minute.
Oh.
We're recording this.
Oh,
so
sorry. You didn't tell me that.
I gave you the dress code, man. What else?
I mean, I wore a white shirt.
Okay, I'll watch what I say now.
Okay.
So policy and incentives question, the tools that you have that would allow patient segmentation, tighter trials, et cetera, in theory, you could turn those same tools on currently marketed, broadly prescribed drugs
Yep.
and sort people into those who really receive no clinical benefit, or there's no hypothesis why they would, and those who would. Do you see any reason that the public, in the public interest, that government regulators would actually try to expect that these tools would be put on currently marketed drugs,
Yeah, right after the
post-approval,
loss of exclusivity.
sort of
that'd be perfect, yeah.
triage what we're paying for today? What's the role of the government in that? Because if I'm currently marketing one of those drugs, I don't necessarily want to figure out which third of the patients aren't benefiting.
So it's an enormously complicated question. The government's going to have a hard time regulating that. And the FDA, for all their stances, basically sort of distance themselves from any pricing discussions and any pharmacoeconomic decisions, although I think that's starting to quietly change, but not by policy. So I think it's going to be a while before policy and government regulation will make that a mandate. And I think by the time that happens, the new drugs from the early pipeline are going to be embedded and just totally imbued with that whole concept. So, I think we're in this transition state, actually. If you look at new drugs, the best example is, checkpoint inhibitors, one that's familiar to me. And so these are, revolutionary drugs. So these are ones that bind PD-1. These are ones that sort of wake up the immune system in cancer. It's, the invention of the year, Nobel Prize forthcoming. As single agents, they work in about 20 to 25% of the people at best. And so now there's enormous pressure and competition to drive to patient selection, even with these approved drugs, because 4 or 5 groups have them. And so we're competition. Again, I'm going to sound like a Republican here, and for the record, I'm not. But the free market will drive these things with existing drugs. I'm more focused, frankly, on the next generation of drugs coming to make sure that we never look back on drugs with 20% response rate or marginal clinical benefit that are extracting from the healthcare system more than they should. I just don't see it happening soon, and I'm not sure I would advocate that regulation would make it any better, personally.
Driving over, I was listening to an NPR story that was about a drug study that came out of an ALS kind of community conversation of people with ALS disease who discovered apparently that a particular nutritional supplement had remarkable benefits to them. This led to this very simplified study, kind of the community-wide engagement, radically lower cost, radically simplified design study. It made me wonder if there's are there things on the horizon that could be sort of radical redesigns of drug studies, clinical studies, and also something that could occur like this, which apparently seemed to occur, where there's a disintermediation between the kind of the powers that be and the people that actually have the disease state, and them rising up and saying, look, we need to look at this, and setting in motion something to make that happen. That can now happen digitally because they can connect to each other, they can have these conversations, and it just struck me as a major new force maybe that is emerging out there. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we talked about this just briefly, this notion of what's driving people's motivation. In this industry, people don't go into drug development, at least from the research and development side, to make money. And I mean that very sincerely. We go in at some level to make new drugs and to help people. I think these are unbelievable new advances that you describe. And when you talk about crowdsourcing and you talk about these new sort of socially based clinical trials, it's an unbelievably empowering part of drug development to have patients aggregate and to self-assemble into groups of advocacy and demand for products and new innovation. So I think that's going to become a huge part of how we do clinical trials, and particularly in rare diseases. I mean, ALS is, I wouldn't call it ultra rare, but it's still rare relative to some of the common diseases we treat. I think in smaller markets, that's going to happen right away, where drug companies view this as a positive across the board. I still think, as a society, we have to figure out where the innovation is going to come, and there have to be some economic incentives to bring new drugs to the market that can be profitable for companies. I mean, it's still, there's part and parcel. I mean, in this instance, you talk about a nutraceutical and, the margins are low, and, folks, that's a great example of when things can really work. But I still think that's the exception, when people are going to find something off the shelf that's safe and effective, that takes the drug companies out of the mix and provides this great new drug for a terrible disease like ALS. I think it's that partnership where people are really going to benefit. And I think if people assemble and drive that, it's going to make all of this more efficient. If people look for drugs, and if people are screened and sequenced and come with defined subgroups of ALS, right? Because ALS is a perfect example. There are a couple, I don't know how many mutations, but some. So there's already genetically defined ALS. If they came to the drug company and said, here we are with SOD. We have SOD mutations, and so you guys have a drug that we think could work on this. I think there will be unbelievable receptivity. So if that knowledge exists in the public sphere, it's going to benefit everybody. So I think everyone embraces that. And if people don't, then they're just on the wrong side of the fence.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
One more, okay.
Thank you. Science has a lot of mental models and assumptions that drive how you do work. That they're sort of part of the culture. You stop thinking about them and you just go with a certain process. If you were to think of an assumption that you would attack right now that may not be true anymore, that could accelerate drug development and lower cost, what would you target?
So it had to be like the hardest question last. Isn't it time to break? I don't know.
The
Now
beer is
remember,
forthcoming.
We promised you a beer if you do a good job.
Okay, so
Okay, and this is the test.
I'm going to practice and say I don't know. Let me think about that. I honestly will think about it and tell you before I leave, because I don't think I don't want to just answer with trivial, we don't understand science well enough, and so we have to be more agnostics. I mean, so let me think about that. It's kind of a tough way to end. Is there an easy question that we could, But it's a really good question so you're asking is there an assumption that's just patently wrong?
Well, this whole conference is about saving costs and doing better, and the way we do science now is driven by a whole bunch of assumptions that comes from universities and how we're trained. Those assumptions, from my experience, are often no longer true because we stop asking, why do we do it this way? We just run off and do it. Your scientists do it every time they're in the lab. So if every single person and every single day asks themselves, now, why am I doing this? And should I be doing this? And maybe I should talk to Robert about, why do we do it this way? You might come up with a single idea that could revolutionize things, and I bet you it's very simple and it will cost you nothing.
I would generalize what you're saying.
I
I'll tell you the secret to my white hair and longevity, okay? I have one secret, and that is, with my students and with my colleagues over all these years, my only consistent value add is to ask them to identify their assumptions. Because people not only don't question their assumptions. They don't need to identify them. Once you get them established, so you're onto a very important
Yeah,
thing.
I think you are too.
And the question is, and I don't think they're just science assumptions by any means, right?
It's social.
Oh, yeah.
All kinds of assumptions, like,
I mean, I can tell you that, that the assumption that more people working on a problem is better is not, I think that's a bad assumption. And so, but I do think it's a provocative question to end with, because I think that, you could go down, you could pick a program. I'm a practical guy. You pick a program and I think to Lee's point, figure out what the assumptions are. But I do think that you're making an important general point that should be underscored, that I'm sure there are things that we do by routine that we're not thinking about that, could, if changed, alter the efficiency at which we do things. And I don't get the sense that we think about that question as often as we
I
might.
bet there's no department or anybody in charge of running that to ground in your company.
Now, are you advocating? Are you looking for that role? I'm teasing. No, I'm teasing. But
I'm just saying, I worked at Boeing, I worked
Yeah.
at Microsoft, and those roles have to come out of the woodwork because nobody thinks it's important enough to check the assumptions. Unless you're in innovation and creativity and that's your thing, and then you begin to think about that all the time.
But I think you're,
I think that organizations aren't really designed, they're designed to do and produce, not to slow down and reflect.
No, there's a ton of, what Gillis and the late Dave Fanning used to call strategery, right? We spend a ton of our time talking to ourselves and convincing ourselves that what we're doing is really important. I remember, in the early days when Virginia Mason went out to Japan and was talking to Toyota about changing efficiencies, that was a slightly different model, which is, trying to really optimize an existing process. But you're right, people don't, what you described is not rewarded. There's no reward structure, and in fact, you end up just being the person in the meeting that people look at and say and then just continue with the meeting. Yeah, exactly. Who
I'd love
hired?
to have people question some of the key assumptions in this industry.
Yeah.
One of the assumptions is that you really do need to spend the 50% of total cost that goes to phase 3 trials. Do you really? I'd like to question. Really? Do we have another assumption? Is there's no business model that really works with truly preventative drugs, in spite of our experience. So that we're under investigating and investing in prevention. Well, I'd like to see that assumption really questioned. Because your point is, not only are there assumptions, there are some assumptions that are directly associated with what's wrong with our approach to drug development.
Well, I can channel Lee
So-
Hood, right? Who's at Aravale, whose now whole assumption is that wellness is more important than illness, right? That's an assumption that he's making, which I think is really forward thinking, and so I think it can be approached broadly and at a very microscopic level.
All right. I think one of the
Thank you.
assumptions that we made when we invited Rob was that it was going to be a great time. So would you help me in thanking him?
So, thank you.
And we not only promised him a beer, we have one for you as well. Please
Thank you.
continue the conversation and enjoy the hospitality of Canby Grove.